Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/Ask Psych Sessions. That's bit.ly/Ask Psych Sessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thanks for joining us today. My guest is Belém Lopez from the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks for coming in to chat today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So before we talk teaching, could you tell the listener a little bit about what your role at UT is? What courses do you teach, undergrad, grad, and maybe a little bit about your research background?
Yeah, totally. So my academic training has been in psychology and linguistics. My PhD is actually in cognitive psychology, but I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Mexican American, Latina Studies at UT, where I primarily teach classes on language. I teach a class called Bilingual Minds. I've taught another class called Latinx in Language, Latinx Psychology, and in terms of graduate classes, I've taught a Latinx linguistic repertoire class, and I teach a couple, those are my main courses, and then I have independent studies where students work in my lab, which is called the Llama Lab.
Did you say the Llama Lab?
I did. It stands for Latinos Language and Mexican American Studies, and our logo is a llama on the phone because in Spanish, it's basically a bilingual pun, like a llama que llama, because llama is also talking. So it's, yeah, we don't have visuals, but it would be a cute llama on the phone.
I can definitely see this and I love it. And I need to rename my lab. So let's talk maybe a bit about being in a non-psychology department. As a psychologist, I assume this is more of an interdisciplinary department. Can you talk a little bit about why that could be really helpful for students to get that interdisciplinary lens, especially with something like language?
Yeah, absolutely. So my department is definitely interdisciplinary. I'm one of 3 social scientists now. There's a epidemiologist in the department focused on health disparities. I have a political science colleague, and then we have historians, anthropologists, and as a psychologist who's interested in the mind, particularly bilinguals of Latinx background, I think being in an interdisciplinary department broadens your research perspective. I think the way I theorize about bilinguals, particularly language brokers, which is my research, which I can explain a little bit later, has really transformed in the past 6 years since I've been at UT. I was first a postdoc in Mexican American Studies, and then I was hired as faculty. And I think the research questions that I ask have changed quite a bit. I consider context a lot more when I design an experiment, when I analyze data, when I engage with research. And I think from teaching undergrads, it's actually been some of the best classes I've ever taught. I primarily teach students of color, which is new. And the questions that students bring in, their engagement with the material is at a personal level because they have these experiences. So it leads to really fruitful conversations, which make me very excited about my research.
Thank you. So thinking about that as someone who does teach a significant number of students of color, many of whom are Spanish-English bilingual, but I am not. Are there some things I could do to make my classroom more welcoming and more exciting for them? Like, can I borrow your top 3 suggestions? Are there research topics and research methods I should be bringing in? I guess what I'm saying is I'm open to these questions, but I feel a little stuck about even where to start. And maybe we can even go back to noticing that your department is Latino studies, but you mentioned that your classes are called Latinx.
Yeah, so I'll see how I can address both of those questions. But yeah, my department is, I'll start with the Latinx one because that's in my short-term memory right now. our department is Latino Latina, and that wasn't necessarily something that I was involved with. That was named before I joined the department, but I do use Latinx because Latinx is gender inclusive. But in terms of how my students identify, I always ask them how they prefer to, like, one in gender in their pronouns, but also I have students who don't like to be referred to as Latinx. I have students who identify as Chicana, Chicano, or Chicanx, or Mexican American, Cuban American. And I think it's important to ask students how they want to be referred, like what is their identity, not necessarily because you want to tag them as someone in a particular identity, but when we use these terms, we could still be marginalizing students without knowing it. We had conversations in one of my classes this past semester where some students were very opposed to Latinx because it didn't follow Spanish structure. We read an article in class that explained the importance of Latinx and why people are using Latinx and where Latinx came from. And we had students who began using Latinx in their own language, but we had other students who use Latine because using an E is also gender inclusive. And for them, it follows grammatical structure in Spanish, so they felt more comfortable using it. So I think being open to these conversations and knowing that some students may not agree for various reasons, and paying close attention, I think, is important.
That is helpful and something I can do, especially since I don't teach 200 students. I can certainly learn the important parts of the identity of my students. And so then the second part, what, for those of us that don't maybe have training in bilingualism, but know that this is an important part of the identity of our students, are there particular topics that are really lead to that enthusiasm, or you think it is just much more of having a class that directly relates to them, which doesn't happen all over the curriculum?
I would think it's a combination of both. I think making sure that our classes are diverse and inclusive and equitable, because there are projects even in, say, memory that have looked at how immigration status affects how you remember certain events in your life and how that's tied to language. I'm thinking of a paper by Viorica Marion, I think with Spivey. It was one of the first papers I think I read as an undergrad. And for communities of color, particularly Latinx who may have immigrant backgrounds, I think learning about that can be taken at a personal level and thinking about our own families and how they remember things or how their language experiences change. I study language brokering, which is an informal translation experience where bilingual children of immigrants, children and adolescents, translate and interpret for their parents, say at the doctor's office, parent-teacher conferences, at restaurants, in a drive-through. And I have a lot of students that once I lecture about this topic, they're like, I do that all the time. I didn't know that people studied it or that they cared. So I think bringing in certain topics, I was a language broker, so I want to learn about myself and why I grew up speaking two languages, but also translating for both of my parents as well as extended family members and other community members. There's also there's online resources, and I'm going to forget the name, but someone posted this wonderful Google sheet, I believe, where it has topics, papers, authors, all people of color who are contributing to psych that they've encouraged folks to pull articles for their syllabi. So I think there are resources online. Spark Society has their their Google, sheet with scholars of color. I know Megan Figueroa also has one for linguistics, like scholars of color that you should be reading. These resources are available. I think people need to be conscientious when they're putting together their syllabi. And if they really are about diversity and inclusion, making sure that they're including non-white scholars in their syllabi.
Thank you. And yes, I do have a link to at least I think the first debate as you mentioned, and that person was a guest on the podcast, so I'll add that to the show notes. But those other two suggestions are helpful. The language brokering I was just going to say that that's really interesting and something that's not a term that I'm familiar with and that I'm definitely going to bring into my methods class. So maybe I'll just ask you a tweak question. Because it's a methods class, we read from a variety of spaces. So I sent an email to my students just to ask what identities are important to you or to your loved ones, and what would you like to read about? Instead, we may not get to everything because we're only going to read 10, but you'll have other opportunities. Does that feel like a fair way to start admitting, listen, I want to pay attention to who you are?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to get started in involving students in, the course prep. I think even including a survey. I do a survey with my students where I ask them, what are your interests in taking the class? And I get students who say like, oh, I'm bilingual. Oh, I'm Latinx. My parents are bilingual, but I didn't learn the language. So I want to learn a little bit more about what happens when you speak two languages. So I think even in because students have an interest or they have to take a class because it fits a requirement. But asking them their interests, I think helps, but also asking them, what do you want to learn this semester? Or what are you wanting to learn? And checking in throughout the semester. I had an open session in one of my undergraduate classes last semester where I left it open and we decided, what are we going to, I let the students decide what they wanted to cover the last 2 days of class for the semester. And it was my Latinx and language class. And students, we came up with the idea of watching TikTok videos that related to course concepts and discussing them in the last 2 days of class. And I'm all for social media use in the classroom, but my students demonstrated in that last two classes what they've actually learned throughout the whole semester. So that was actually really fun for me because I didn't have to prep anything, but my students introduced me to TikTok.
That's brilliant and sounds very fun at a time when everyone's really stressed. So not only do you have to demonstrate learning, but hopefully it was a very positive, kind of energy. I'm thinking about my last 2 sessions of methods that are like prepping for a cumulative final. Not quite so joyful, I'm guessing. So thank you for that, great Suzuka. Maybe as we start to wrap this up a bit, is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know to help them be more effective faculty members in the classroom, especially maybe as it relates to issues of bilingualism or things that might be associated there, like being a first-generation college student, for example?
Yeah, in bilingualism, you constantly read that bilingualism is the norm and monolingualism is actually the exception. And I think we need to take that into consideration when we think about bilingual populations. Like the US is a monolingual country, and most other countries are bilingual. Not to say that there aren't bilinguals and multilinguals in the US, but especially in the classroom, we really need to, if we are about embracing diversity in the classroom, we also need to realize that a lot of our students have had unequal opportunities to education, especially first-gen students. I'm a first-gen college student. I'm a daughter of Mexican immigrants, and navigating college and graduate school and now the academy is difficult. I had to translate to my parents what FAFSA was. They thought getting a Pell Grant meant that I was going to have to pay that back once I finished undergrad. And I had to explain to my parents that, no, this is money from the government to pay for my schooling. And that took a lot of work. And then being an undergrad and thinking, oh, I'm just going to get my psych degree and, be done with it. But then learning, oh, I can do research. And I think as professors, we can take a really active role in the classroom and encouraging students to participate in research, even if they're not psych majors. In my lab, I've had students from Spanish and Portuguese. I had an engineering student once just because he was interested in being in the Llama Lab. I've had computer science. I have quite a few psych students, human development, but most of my students tend to be first gen. And it might be because I'm very upfront about being first gen, but I think we do have to be active in recruiting students and moving away from this idea that we can only have students who we know we're going to send to graduate school. Like, I think working in a research lab, learning about research just makes you a better citizen of the world, for lack of a better term.
So thank you. That's an excellent point to make sure those of us that are doing research with undergraduates are taking a broad lens, that this is just not a place to make people ready to apply for PhD programs at graduation, that these are important workforce graduate skills, and like you said, more informed citizens. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your insights and ideas, and that you brought the idea of bring a really good lab name in. So I wish you a successful spring semester.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I've been talking today with Balaam Lopez from University of Texas, Austin.